Good afternoon and welcome to the CarbonStore webinar, Woodland Carbon, Unlocking an Increasingly Valuable Income Stream. I'm Stuart Pearson, a Chartered Forester and Business Development Director for Teal Hill Forestry, the UK's leading sustainable forestry and timber harvesting company. I've worked in forestry for nearly 40 years and will be your host for today's webinar. Our expert team at CarbonStore will discuss the government's Woodland Carbon Code, which is a quality assurance standard for woodland creation projects in the UK, and the opportunities it presents to farmers and landowners. Please do place your questions in the Q&A box, and our speakers, Alex and David, will answer them at the end of the webinar after their presentations. So first up, we have Alex McKinnon, CarbonStore's Carbon Project Manager. Highly experienced with the Woodland Carbon Code's technicalities, Alex will give a short recap on the code's main principles before outlining the various costs which woodland owners face. He will also discuss some of the choices they must take when designing the optimal carbon-orientated woodland. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Stuart. Right, hopefully you can all see that. So good afternoon, and thank you everyone for your time today. As CarbonStore's project manager, my role involves validating and verifying woodlands with the Woodland Carbon Code, which allows me to understand very well all of the intricacies associated with the code. For such a complicated protocol, it's inevitable that the devil lies in the detail. My presentation will therefore focus on the risks to be aware of and the trade-offs you face when designing a woodland which is eligible for carbon funding. I'll start with a quick recap of the Woodland Carbon Code's main elements. You may already understand these, however, it's probably worth repeating them. There are 3 steps necessary to generate a verified woodland carbon unit. The first step involves registering your intention to plant a woodland with the Woodland Carbon Code, and this must take place before planting starts, and it requires 2 documents: a map outlining the area you intend to plant that adheres to the code's strict mapping guidance, and the code's Woodland Carbon Calculator. I'll explain this in more detail later, but it's a separate spreadsheet onto which you enter the area to be planted, the species mix, the yield class, and the management regime, etc. The second step is the validation of your woodland by the code. This is a desk-based audit that confirms due process has been followed in the planting work. For example, that local stakeholders have been consulted and that environmental regulations have been upheld. And it culminates with the issuance of PIUs into the project's account on the UK Land Carbon Registry. The third verification, this is the third audit of your woodland, which calculates the volume of captured carbon. This calculation then informs a number of PIUs, i.e. promises to capture a tonne of carbon, to be converted into WCUs, i.e. confirmed tonnes of captured carbon. The first verification occurs 5 years after planting and is essentially a monitoring survey which verifies the number of trees and their health. After that, the woodlands are then verified every 10 years with mensuration survey measuring the volume of standing timber. As part of this quick recap, I'll also outline the main characteristics of the PIUs and WCUs, which I mentioned earlier. A PIU is a legally recognised and saleable carbon unit. However, being issued soon after planting, it represents only a promise to capture 1 tonne of carbon. Thus, the seller of a PIU undertakes certain commitments, and if those obligations are unfulfilled, the seller incurs certain liabilities. As a result, accountants would treat the sale of a PIU as incurring a liability. That liability is converted into an asset once the PIU becomes a woodland carbon unit, or WCU. For companies buying WCUs, they can offset immediately against their emissions because those claims are backed by a tonne of carbon for which sequestration has been confirmed. And in contrast, the owner of a PIU can only say that they are on the way to being or working towards carbon neutrality because the carbon capture is contingent on the trees growing healthily. The chart at the top of the page illustrates the relationship between PIUs and WCUs. Just after planting, with no carbon captured, 100% of the units are PIUs. However, as the trees grow and the carbon sequestration is confirmed at each verification, a growing proportion of the PIUs are converted into WCUs, so that at the end of the project's duration, 100% of the outstanding units are WCUs. When registering a woodland with the Woodland Carbon Code, there are 3 key points to keep in mind. It involves a long-term commitment, so it's important to select the appropriate length of that commitment, and I'll address this point more on slide 6. The woodland must be maintained to a high standard. And finally, participation in the Woodland Carbon Code incurs a relevant sum of costs. The table on this slide illustrates the timing of the carbon capture over a 15-hectare broadleaf woodland. Over 100 years, it's expected to capture 5,819 tonnes of carbon, or WCUs. However, woodland owners must also keep in mind the obligations associated with generating those WCUs. The monitoring survey of a year 5 verification involves a survey of the stocking density across the site, and if this is more than 10% below the targeted rate in any one compartment, the Woodland Carbon Code will ask for remedial action to be implemented, probably involving replanting to ensure the correct stocking density. Any significant loss of trees, for example through wind blow or fire damage on site, will also require the submission of a loss report, and in the words of the Woodland Carbon Code, woodland owners must replant or undertake alternative planting should a woodland area be lost due to wind, fire, pests, or diseases. High silvicultural standards must therefore be maintained on projects seeking to generate carbon-related income, and there is an added layer of risk when receiving carbon income. Seeking proper management from a professional company such as Tillhill will mitigate this risk significantly. In addition to these responsibilities, woodland owners should also be aware that the costs associated with the Woodland Carbon Code. As this table shows, the costs of validation amount to roughly £4,500. The auditor's fees are meaningful, and it takes us about 2.5 days' work to prepare the project design document ready for submission to the auditors and then answer their questions about the various documents. Each verification costs approximately £4,500. A monitoring survey is necessary. The 18-page project progress report must be completed, and again, the audit costs are not inconsiderable. As a result, the total costs for a 65-year project are close to £36,000. There are 3 further points to highlight about the costs. Firstly, they are largely fixed. As such, they vary little between a 5-hectare woodland and a 50-hectare woodland. Secondly, they unfortunately render projects of less than around 4 to 5 hectares unviable, as they don't generate enough PIUs to cover the costs. And thirdly, by placing projects within a group, we can reduce the auditor's costs by almost £15,000, as you can see in the lower part of the table. To explain this a bit more, for an auditor verifying single projects, every project must be visited on the ground. However, when validating a group of projects or verifying a group of projects, the auditor selects a representative sample, thus saving time and cost. Unfortunately, projects can only be grouped if they sit within the same project developer's account on the registry. So this is a key advantage of using CarbonStore to register and validate your project. With over 170 projects registered with the code, we have the scale necessary to create many of these groups. So returning to my earlier point, what's the optimal length or duration of a project? The table on slide 6 represents the carbon calculator on slide 4 in the context of costs and net income. Over 100 years, the woodland will capture 5,819 tonnes of carbon. However, a woodland owner will want to strike a balance between maximising income and minimising the risk. A 100-year project length might generate the maximum income, but it also brings extra costs and additional risks. As the table here shows, in the decade between years 65 and 75, the woodland will generate an additional 127 WCUs. However, it will only generate £1,580 in additional net income, whilst also extending the project commitment period by an extra 10 years. So for this 15-hectare broadleaf woodland, we would believe that the project duration of 55 or 65 years is most appropriate. The finer details will be determined by the woodland owner's personal preferences, but hopefully these broad principles guide their thinking. So for woodland owners seeking to maximize the total income from their woodland from both timber and carbon, careful thought has to be given towards its design and species mix. For example, what balance should they strike between amenity broadleaves and productive conifers? As Table 1 on slide 7 shows, the carbon capture characteristics of these two types of woodland are very different. According to the Woodland Carbon Code, 1 hectare of productive conifer being harvested at year 45 will generate approximately 182 carbon units. In contrast, 1 hectare of broadleaves managed with minimal intervention will generate approximately 596 carbon units. As Table 2 shows, the optimal mix will depend on the relative prices of timber and carbon. At current prices of approximately £50 per tonne of timber and £40 per WCU, productive conifers will generate approximately £26,000 per hectare against £23,000 from broadleaves. This highlights some important issues. David will discuss the positive outlook for PRU prices in his presentation next. And if prices do rise, farmers and landowners will face a choice between optimal silvicultural standards and maximising financial gain. By planting the UK countryside with only minimal intervention broadleaves, we risk sterilising those woodlands for any other economically beneficial purpose. And in a country which imports 80% of our timber imports, commending ourselves for our ecological sensitivity whilst exporting the growing of our timber to foreign shores is both disingenuous and economically short-sighted. The ironies of the Woodland Carbon Code's carbon calculator present woodland owners with another dilemma. It's well known that thinning a woodland is good silvicultural practice. It produces larger and healthier trees. It also allows light to the forest floor, increases the diversity of the understory, and encourages more wildlife. However, the Woodland Carbon Code essentially discourages this beneficial approach to woodland management. As Table 1 illustrates, selecting to thin a woodland as part of your management regime significantly reduces your potential income. 1 hectare of broadleaf woodland will see its carbon capture decline by 42%. Meantime, thinning will also reduce carbon captured on 1 hectare of productive conifer woodland by 35%. In such situations, we would always recommend following the best silvicultural practice. In 40 to 50 years' time, when our grandchildren survey the dense thickets of woodland which the code risks creating, they will surely question our sanity just as much as we question the judgment of our predecessors who planted large swathes of monocultures. I focused today on the intricacies of the Woodland Carbon Code's carbon calculator. However, there is one further document worthy of closer scrutiny. Many of you will be familiar with the code's additionality test. It's another formulaic spreadsheet designed to assess whether or not carbon funding is an essential component to a woodland's viability. And it starts by aggregating the total income from the woodland, excluding carbon, so from grant funding and timber, etc., and then subtracts the total costs of the woodland creation and management work to calculate the woodland's net income. This net income is then compared to the income which the land would have earned had it not been planted with trees. If the woodland's net income, excluding carbon, is smaller than the income which led to, which the land would have generated without planting, the code reasons the carbon is an essential element and the woodland's economic viability, and is then considered eligible for carbon funding. For woodland owners seeking to maximise both their grant income and their timber income, deft handling of this spreadsheet is therefore required. The assumed previous land use has a significant influence on the results of this test. It may also be advantageous to those projects with higher costs as this reduces the net income. Either way, like the drafting of the carbon calculator, the additionality test is an important consideration when designing a woodland creation scheme where expert knowledge and experience is necessary to maximise the opportunities. So please do feel free to email us at CarbonStore if you have any questions. I hope this has all made good sense, and please feel free to reach out if not. But with that, I will pass back to Stuart, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alex. Remember, if you do have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box for David and Alex, and they will answer them after this final presentation. Now we have David McCulloch, Head of CarbonStore, who will explain how companies, fund managers, farmers and landowners engaging with the market. He will discuss the implications of recent pricing trends, and he will highlight some of the medium and longer term issues with which both buyers and sellers of PIUs and WCUs should consider. Over to you, David.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for your time today as well. And I hope you're able to see that clearly. So, among the various carbon markets developing across the UK, the one for woodland carbon is by far the most advanced. We've got our own well-established and widely respected carbon standard, the Woodland Carbon Code. We've got a recognised transaction process, and we're getting improving transparency in the pricing of PIUs and WCUs. And above all, woodland owners are making good money from selling their PIUs and their WCUs. So as such, the woodland carbon market offers a valuable template for the future shape of other carbon markets, for example, for soil, for peatland, for hedgerow carbon. And I therefore hope the next 15 minutes not only helps you to understand the various actors and forces that are influencing our own market for woodland carbon, but also helps build a picture of the future shape of others, and in so doing helps you work out how best to participate. So a useful starting point involves listing our various services, who we're working with, how we're engaging with clients, and what help they are needing. So as Alex's presentation has shown, our project development work is the engine room of our business. By getting woodlands accredited and issued with PIUs and WCUs, we're generating the increasingly prized commodity that is a woodland carbon credit. As we've also seen, there is a myriad of technicality and complexity around the validation and the verification processes. Even experienced forestry managers find it challenging. And we therefore offer advice and support both to Till Hills forestry managers and to other independent forest managers, estate foresters, and land agents when they're costing, designing, validating, or verifying woodlands. Our other staple service involves arranging the sale and the purchase of PIUs and or WCUs. This is still a relatively involved and complicated process, so we guide both the buyer, usually a company, and the seller, a woodland owner, through the process, helping them to agree a fair price, to understand the legal contracts, and to navigate the UK Land Carbon Registry, which Alex mentioned earlier. We're also working with a growing number of fund management companies. They expect the prices of timber, carbon, and or land to rise, and they're putting their money to work accordingly. So as a result, there are two approaches that are being adopted. Some are buying the land directly, and in this case, we work with Till Hills Forestry Investment Team to help them assess the carbon-related costs and income, and to design a woodland that optimizes their potential income. Interestingly, a growing number of fund managers are also seeking to partner with long-term landowning organizations to secure exposure to carbon credits. And this approach has various advantages. It narrows their exposure to either carbon and or timber prices. Due to the poor liquidity of the land market, it also helps them put their money to, or helps them deploy more capital and increases the size of their projects. And finally, it maintains the fabric of the existing community, and it avoids some of the public relations risks that have been faced by Brewdog and other companies. So under this arrangement, the landowner will host the planting scheme or the peatland restoration project, for which they will receive a payment from the fund manager. That payment will be determined A, by the scale of the project, and B, by the volume of carbon credits which the land is expected to generate. Meantime, the fund manager will assume responsibility for the project's implementation and its success. They will also take ownership of the ensuing carbon credits. Finally, we're also helping companies engage with landowners to secure carbon credits. And as the scale of their engagement grows, there are various approaches which they're adopting as well. We're offering consultancy type advice for companies contemplating the purchase of PIUs to understand what their options are, what the costs are likely to be. And the answers to the various questions very often then inform the presentations that sustainability managers make to their senior directors in order to then secure the budget approval, and we can help them inform their decisions. We're also starting to get larger inquiries from companies looking to buy hundreds of thousands of validated PIUs from woodlands which have already been planted. And with very few standalone projects generating more than 20 or 30,000 PIUs, aggregation of multiple projects is necessary to accommodate these volume requirements. So again, with some of the most robust legal contracts in the sector, we're well placed to support these demands. And then finally, certain larger companies are also contemplating long-term partnerships with landowners in an approach similar to that being adopted by fund managers. So what prices can woodland owners expect to achieve for their PIUs? What can they be doing to maximize those prices? And how will evolving regulations help them secure higher prices? A look at recent pricing data offers some clues. The map on slide 5 illustrates prices for PIUs, which range from £25 up to £75, depending on the characteristics of the underlying woodland. Projects in higher price bracket generally have 3 similarities. They are owned and managed by charities or other third sector organizations. So the underlying woodlands are more likely to be generating widespread social benefits. For example, public access is often welcomed and educational resources are often provided. They are all prioritizing ecological enhancement and restoration. And finally, because the woodlands are owned and managed by charities, companies buying the PIUs have more trust that the proceeds from the carbon funding are being deployed in socially beneficial objectives. In contrast, private woodland owners are selling only a carbon credit to companies, which for PIUs are actually just future carbon credits. There are some price variations depending on the woodland's location, its proximity to centres of population, and the opportunity for people to appreciate its beauty and the wildlife within it. However, in essence, private owners are only selling what has been approved and authorised by the Woodland Carbon Code. So this introduces the concepts of stacking and bundling, which represent 2 different approaches to quantifying and evaluating the various benefits associated with woodland creation. Charities and third sector organisations have adopted the approach of bundling. They have aggregated all the social, ecological, and hydrological benefits of their woodland creation projects, wrapped them into the carbon credit, and then sold them as one supercharged credit. In reality, this supercharged credit has only one legally recognised function as a carbon credit. However, the wider benefits of these woodlands also help sprinkle the owners of the associated PIUs with some philanthropic stardust. And they are therefore willing to pay higher prices for the PIUs. In contrast, the stacking approach involves quantifying and legitimising each of the additional benefits associated with the woodland before then selling the ensuing credits separately. depending on whether organisations need a water quality credit, nature credit, or a carbon credit. The current popularity of bundling by charitable organisations reflects a canny effort to exploit their clients' altruistic aspirations and to get round the Woodland Carbon Code's additionality test. Unfortunately, no such opportunity exists for the private sector, whose client base is focused mainly on their net zero targets, and due to their larger volume requirements, is also keen to limit their costs. So the scarcity of the stacking approach so far partly reflects the market's infancy. The regulatory environment supporting both the need for and the supply of wider nature-based credits lags that of the carbon market. But thankfully, it's catching up fast. In June 2021, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures was launched, and it aims to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive outcomes. This was then followed in November 2022 by the EU Parliament ratifying the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will require all types of companies to measure and report their impact on biodiversity by 2030. In March 2023, the UK started to reflect these global initiatives with its own strategy when it issued the Nature Markets Framework, which outlined the government's approach for scaling up private investment into nature's recovery and sustainable farming. Further announcements from the Science Based Targets Network and the United Nations have emphasized the political momentum that's underpinning these pronouncements. And in a speech to the CLA conference in November 2023, Steve Barclay, the Environment Secretary, reiterated the government's target to increase annual private investment in nature to 500 million by 2027 and to 1 billion by 2030. The development of the Woodland Water Code represents a step in this direction. It is being led by Forest Research using funding from the UK government via DEFRA's Nature for Climate Fund programme. The Woodland Water Code's objective is to facilitate quantification of water benefits provided by woodland creation projects. And the timings are relatively imminent. In January 2023, the Woodland Carbon Code approved integration of the Woodland Water Code into its governance structure. Forest Research is currently running a desk-based pilot project, which will conclude in September this year. And then it's hoped that the Woodland Water Code will launch in March 2025. So to conclude the presentation, I'd just like to offer some thoughts on the future direction of PRU and WCU prices. Woodland creation is an expensive undertaking, and it can cost up to £8,000 per hectare once the opportunity costs of the previous land use are considered. So this means the costs of the UK's woodland creation targets of 30,000 a year are approaching £6 billion. And the government, not surprisingly, is probably keen to shift the burden of those costs onto the private sector. The markets for nature-based credit and carbon credits offer the ideal solution. According to recent research by Foresight and King's College London, current prices of approximately £25 per PRU are sufficient to render just 35% of land as economically viable under woodland creation. The report then recommends allowing WCUs to be included within the UK ETS, and this is the UK's emissions trading system. And put simply, it is where companies operating in energy-intensive industries must compulsorily purchase carbon credits. And it is widely hoped that this will lead to an increase in carbon credit prices. Finally, I mentioned earlier the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And starting in 2025, it will mandate that businesses have a Paris Agreement aligned emissions reduction plan to reach net zero by 2050. The CSRD has taken its cue from the International Sustainability Standards Board and the Task Force for Carbon-Related Financial Disclosures, to which the UK is fully committed. We can therefore expect more companies to be shining a brighter light on their carbon emissions with greater scrutiny over their net zero plans. And this increasingly robust regulatory environment offers an encouraging prospect for prices of the PIUs and the WCUs issued by the Woodland Carbon Code. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to you, Stuart.
Thank you, David. If I could now ask David and Alex to join me for the Q&A section. Thank you for anybody that's posted a question. We've got a few in. Don't be shy. More the merrier. We'll get through these now. A reminder that a recording of the webinar will be sent to you directly via email to watch back next week. So without further ado, a couple of questions here. First one, what are the methods of monitoring or verifying that bundled credits are indeed doing what they say? Who wants to answer that one? David.
Yeah, Phil, last week we were out on site doing some year 5 verifications, and it's a pretty thorough process. We work out the plots before going out on site. Then we go to each of the plots across the woodland. We're measuring the average height of the trees, the stocking density, the health of the trees, any signs of risks such as deer browsing or weed suppression. The fence is in good condition, and then that is all written up very thoroughly in the project progress report, or actually it's submitted to the Soil Association and their auditor. If the stocking density is more than 10% below target, then there's a requirement for remedial action. So it's a really thorough and robust process, basically.
Yeah, and to add to that, specifically with regards to bundled credits, where there are other benefits as well that need to be measured and quantified, as you're pointing out, Phil. It's a good question because it's a bit debatable. The Woodland Carbon Code is there to thoroughly measure the carbon sequestered, but it doesn't cover any other benefits particularly well. So we are working with people that are looking at DNA sampling and things like that to provide an ecological baseline. Obviously, there's all of the associated surveys of usual woodland creation, but there are some really interesting technologies coming out, like DNA sampling, that will really help with that baselining and measuring and quantifying those bundled advantages of the credit. But I would say it is a bit of a weak point still. There aren't yet fundamental sort of tools there to measure those particularly well yet. It's very difficult to measure a water quality increase or a water or a flood mitigation and things like that. So it's still difficult, but there are developing ways to do it.
Thank you for that, Alex. Another question here. To what extent are PIUs and WCUs actually being purchased at the prices listed during David's presentation, i.e. is there demand for credits at those high prices?
I am reporting what I've heard, and certainly that is reflected within the data coming out of the Woodland Carbon Code's pricing data, where you look at the spread price between the highest price achieved and the lowest price achieved, and that spread is over £40, and then the volume weighted average price in there is £25. So yeah, the official data confirms it, and that's what I'm hearing through contacts as well.
Excellent. Here's a good one. Do you get many corporates wanting to visit the site or wanting to put up signs advertising such?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that we were, I mean, Ross, as you know, that's something that we included within our legal contracts. And certain companies where they are buying all of the PIUs attached to a specific woodland are keen to go down that route and identify themselves specifically with that woodland. However, the way the market is developing, we are seeing the structure of the PIU sales. What we're seeing is increasingly we're selling sort of tranches of PIUs by vintage. So a company will buy all of the PIUs within a certain vintage, perhaps between 2035 and 2045. But the woodland owner won't be selling any between 2045 and 2055. Let's put it like that. So it depends what the structure of the transaction is in a nutshell.
Good. Have you done schemes with mixed habitats owned by county councils with public access, probably using bundle approach? Perhaps where the authority is enhancing, restoring the site, a bit of planting other habitats, better public access, etc.
I can go for this one. I don't think we've done a project for a county council yet, although I don't see why that would ever be an issue. Mixed sites, different kind of habitat restoration. Yes, definitely. We've done natural regen sites for the Woodland Carbon Code. We've done different areas of planting. We've done areas of open ground. Some of the schemes have, wetland areas included in them. So yes, that's not a problem. The Woodland Carbon Code is slightly black and white when it comes to things like that. They'll probably want to see an exact boundary of the Woodland Carbon Code project area and say, right, that's the area of woodland creation, that's going under the Woodland Carbon Code, and the rest, although it is, in reality on the ground, it is additional to the site. In the Woodland Carbon Code's slightly narrow vision, they would only look at the woodland creation areas, be it natural regen or planting. Yeah, they would be slightly black and white about that and probably kind of ignore the other areas. But yes, schemes like that can definitely be a thing and carry on.
And here's a very pertinent question, very dear to my heart in the commercial silvicultural world. What are your thoughts? You indicate that productive conifer forests can secure carbon credits for sale. Yet in construction, if we use a timber product from sustainably managed forestry, current methodologies suggest that we can't take credit for the biogenic carbon in the building life cycle analysis. Double counting aside, i.e. assuming the conifer forest isn't selling carbon credits, it seems there's a disconnect between what the carbon markets are allowing and what LCA in the construction industry is allowing under existing LCA methodologies.
Yeah, Kirsten, it's a good question, and there is a disconnect there because in essence there isn't double counting. Even if you're selling carbon credits that are generated by a coniferous woodland, there's a long explanation behind that. So please get in touch and email me if you want to understand that long and detailed reasoning. To be totally honest, we're seeing sort of a lack of joined up thinking in other sort of ways that woodland carbon is treated and accounted for in other parts of the market. And it sounds like it's applicable here in certain situations. I should caveat. It's quite a long, detailed answer. So please do get in touch separately.
Here's a good one as well. Where the stocking density has been found to be too low, is an option for the scheme owner to simply accept fewer WCUs rather than restocking? And that probably links into one that came in from Wayne. If PIUs don't reach their target WCU, is there a financial reclaim against the seller, or will this be insurance backed? 2 in 1 there.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Is there an option for them simply to accept fewer WCUs rather than restocking? Technically, yes. I think you could purely looking through a Woodland Carbon Code lens, you could not restock, maintain your lower planting densities, and simply be issued fewer units, or give some units back if you've previously, if you've already been awarded them as PIUs. However, that could potentially fall foul of grant contracts as well, because they do also insist on a minimum stocking density. So if the stocking density is too low, you might end up having to give some grant claim back as well. So there's another area to be careful of there. And in terms of if that project had sold those units, so they were no longer in their ownership, then yes, there would definitely be financial reclaim potentially, because they're not delivering on their obligations. In certain cases, it can be insurance backed, but that depends on the level of insurance that the site has got, I think.
Yeah. What's the minimum hectareage eligible for a WCC project? And could multiple smaller parcels of land under the threshold be bundled to create an area that is eligible?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Stuart. There is, in theory, there's no minimum. I mean, I mentioned that sort of 4 to 5 hectares, anything smaller than 4 to 5 hectares isn't viable, and that's really just a cost issue rather than anything. But in theory, there is no minimum. In terms of bundling together a number of smaller parcels of land, it needs to meet certain criteria. Firstly, it all needs to be under the same owner. Secondly, they need to be within the same grant contract. And then thirdly, they need to be planted within 2 years of each other. So if you meet all of those criteria, or if the various parcels of woodland meet all of those 3 criteria, then yes, you could put them all together into one project.
Yeah. Are the buyers taking an ongoing interest in the site and what is going on? If it is mixed, then do you think that as the market develops, they will increase scrutiny, or will they just wait and see if the WCOs appear?
Yeah, okay, I'll take that. So I'll just digest that one. Are the buyers taking an ongoing interest in the site and what is going on? Yes, and I think there's 2 sides to it. Firstly, the woodland owner needs to be conscious of the obligations that are associated, A, with operating under the Woodland Carbon Code, and B, in terms of the sale to the woodland owner, so that if there is a loss report to be submitted, then that's done in good time, and sort of you've got proper engagement with the company, so that you don't just get to the stage where at year 15 and we're a lot short of the expected number of WCUs, so it's one of those situations, Ross. The market, as you know, is relatively immature, and I'm sure companies are going to pay closer and closer attention to the performance of their woodlands, basically.
And do you forecast an uplift in woodland sale values, which include verified PIUs or WC credits? And is there a current demand for such sales?
So is this related to sort of presumably you're selling a woodland which has validated? Yeah. Well, I mean, there's 2 factors. I've sort of outlined my view for carbon prices, and I think the long-term outlook is encouraging on that front. And then there's a separate view on what you think is going to happen to land and forestry prices, and I'm definitely not a specialist on that front.
Yeah, to add to that, neither am I, but I did happen to see from a forestry land agent just yesterday, a project pop up, and the headline was that it had PIUs attached to it, and it was registered with the Woodland Carbon Code. So I think if we can read into that, then there clearly is a market, and it is an asset to have on the property as well.
Right, well, thank you for that. We've come to the end of the posted questions. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. And again, a reminder that recording will be sent to you shortly. If you do have any more questions or want to get in touch about any of our services, please email us at info@carbonstoreuk.com. And we'll also leave the details on the screen for you now. Thank you, and have a good evening, you all.